Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Gayatri, your host, and today we move into episode 10 of Catalyze Your Self Season 3 When We Choose Not to Understand. In our last episode, we stayed with what happens when external signals take the lead. We looked at what begins shifting within us when the outside world stops being information we process and starts becoming the authority we live by. We explored how approval, disapproval, expectation, urgency, performance, and the way we are received can carry disproportionately heavy weight inside our mind. And when that happens, what we know within our own self can begin going quieter, less accessible, and less trustworthy in real time. And today, we dive into another compensatory pattern we can adopt in times of pressure. And this is another that can begin showing up very quietly. This is where we refuse to understand. What we need to know might be right in front of us. We can have all the resources we need and be fully empowered to seek out information we need for our own discernment. Yet, we refuse to take that step, not because we are incapable of understanding, but because what understanding asks of us can be more than we are ready to face. And this is where I want us to place our focus today. There are times in our life when what is happening is not really hidden from us. As a matter of fact, we may have experienced the patterns or the behaviors or the choices or the impact more than once. And yet we can still find ourselves softening, delaying, translating, circling around. So we don't have to accept the meaning and the consequence of what may be truly happening. So today is not simply a conversation about comprehension. It is not about intelligence. It is not about whether we have enough information. It is a conversation about what happens when understanding is denied by our will, our choice, either subconsciously or consciously. And before we move any further, I want to slow down and make something very clear. When I use the word understanding here, I'm not speaking only about intellectual explanation. I'm not speaking about only describing what happened. I'm not speaking about only collecting enough evidence or building a convincing argument. In the context of our conversation today, understanding is when what is already becoming visible within us is allowed to fully integrate with our mind. It is when we know cognitively what we feel emotionally, what we sense in our body, and what our consciousness is already beginning to recognize are all allowed to come into enough collaboration that we can integrate the meaning of it, and that truth and reality can actually land regardless of the cost. In all of our lives, somewhere along the way, we have seen this disconnect, this dissonance, where we have wondered why someone is not able to see, recognize, acknowledge, accept what is happening right in front of them. And this may be a scenario that has happened with our own selves also. The question is, have we recognized it when it has happened? And if someone else has recognized it for us, have we taken the time to slow down and acknowledge that it may truly be happening? I had an instance where this stood out so starkly in my life. There was a friendship circle I was once part of. And over time, one of the individuals in that group began showing me a pattern of behavior that I could no longer call occasional, harmless, or unclear. I recognized the impact of this person's choices on me. I encountered fickle behavior, inconsiderate choices, dishonesty, and an overarching tone of drama and chaos. I gave myself enough time to observe what was actually happening and how it was landing on me, and what that pattern was actually revealing about that entire circumstance. And what became clear to me was that I was going to honor my values, my integrity, and the kind of relationships I actually want to build in my life. And for that, I would need to resolve this friendship, whether it is strengthening it or dissolving it. When I named the behavior directly with this person, the response was not accountability. The focus shift very quickly from the pattern itself and towards how unfair, hurtful, or harsh it was for me to call it out so clearly. In the end, I decided to move out of the friendship with my integrity and my compassion for their journey in life intact. And there was this other person in the same friendship circle who did not meet these behaviors the same way. And I do not mean she simply had a different opinion. I mean, she kept working to soften what was already becoming visible. When I named a behavior fickle, inconsiderate, and dishonest, she kept reaching for reasons that would make it smaller than it was. She would say maybe it was not meant that way. Maybe it was poor communication. Maybe it came from stress. Maybe it looked worse than it actually was. Maybe I was being too final in how I was reading it. And what stood out to me was how much effort was going into not letting the pattern mean what it meant. Because by that point, this was not about one moment. It was many instances through a length of time. Yeah, and yet this individual kept translating what was happening to something that was easier for her to hold, something more excusable, something more manageable, something more comfortable. And that mattered because what was happening was not a lack of information. It was that fully understanding it would have carried a cost that she did not seem ready to face. If she had let herself see the pattern clearly, then she may have had to admit that this was not isolated. She may have had to acknowledge that the friendship was not what she wanted to believe it was. She may have had to feel the loss that comes when someone no longer fits the place that once held your life. And this is one of the quieter ways we choose not to understand. Much later in my life, I encountered this person again, and we reminisced about the past, about that particular friendship scenario. And I learned that this person eventually got to a place where she recognized the same pattern that I noticed at the time. When I was ready to recognize it, she was just not ready. So at that time, she chose not to understand. But when it hit a threshold where she could no longer ignore it, she recognized what was happening and she removed herself from the scenario also. And we do not always do this by denying what happened. Sometimes we choose not to understand by softening it, by translating it into something less disruptive, because the full truth would ask us to alter the version of the person, the situation that we're used to, comfortable with, familiar with. And this change will bring in unfamiliarity, which feels unsafe and unstable. And what does our mind do when it is not grounded in presence and the nervous system is facing extended pressure? It defaults to choices that ensures safety and stability, and rejecting understanding that can change what you know, what you're familiar with, can feel like safety. And to be clear, discernment does matter, context does matter, nuance does matter. We know that. But there are also moments when enough is already present. And what is delaying understanding is not the absence of clarity, it is the discomfort of what the full clarity may require us to face. And this is where it becomes important for us to understand what may be happening in all parts of our mind when we are resisting this understanding. At the level of cognition, where our logical thinking and executive functioning reside, what is happening is reasoning that prioritizes protecting us is being held as stronger versus discerning the truth based on all the information coming to us. We think more, not always because thinking is bringing us towards the truth, but because it is helping us delay what truth would ask of us. We begin explaining, contextualizing, comparing, softening, or asking for just a little bit more information or proof. Our cognition is no longer prioritizing, helping us recognize what is present. It is now focused on helping us manage our discomfort with what is present. And at the level of emotion, something else may already be happening. When our emotional signals show up with disappointment, unease, grief, frustration, or mistrust, we can start suppressing them. When acknowledgement of our emotional signals and understanding feels costly, we may not fully allow emotion to do its work as information. We may explain it away. We may tell ourselves that we are overreacting, that we are reading too much into something. And then there is our layered consciousness, our conscious, our subconscious, and our unconscious. And when we resist understanding, something different is happening in each layer. At the conscious layer, understanding is often already beginning to form. This is the surface layer, the layer of active awareness, the layer where observation and moment-to-moment recognition live. This is usually where we say things like, something feels off. This has happened before, or I don't think I'm reading this wrong. But conscious awareness alone does not guarantee full understanding. We can notice and still not let the noticing deepen or even accept. We can stand near the truth without fully accepting it. At the subconscious layer, the layer that holds our familiar patterns, learned beliefs, repeated responses, conditioned loyalty, and the habits of how we stay connected, accepted, or safe, can begin steering us back towards what it already knows, familiarity. When full understanding can disrupt belonging or familiarity, it disrupts the feeling of safety. It can pull us towards explanations that preserve the pattern rather than any kind of understanding that may interrupt it. And then there's the unconscious, the deepest layer, where older imprints, deeper meanings, our intuition, our unprocessed fear and emotional consequences can live. This layer does not usually speak in explanations. It speaks in sensation, tension, dread, resistance, heaviness, or the feeling that something is just too much before our conscious mind can even fully explain why. The unconscious may already know what full understanding would cost. Grief, loss, disappointment, role change, identity change, or the end of a comforting story. That deeper knowing comes through when we are under pressure, and when a fractured mind faces it, it can feel like making full understanding feel unsafe. And we know our nervous system is the bridge for all of this. It is carrying all the signals between our cognition, our emotions, our consciousness, and our body. And its priority is protection first, familiarity first, predictability first. So if full understanding threatens stability, belonging, image, attachment, or emotional safety, the nervous system can begin treating that understanding itself as something to avoid. So what we are looking here is not a shallow refusal. It is so much more human than that. The conscious layer may already see enough. The subconscious may not want to break patterns. The unconscious may already sense what has the understanding of all of it will cost. And our nervous system may decide that partial understanding feels so much safer than the complete truth. And I want us to widen this beyond our day-to-day world relationships, be it professional or personal, because this pattern is not limited to people we know in our life. We can do this in our parasocial relationships also, with public figures, leaders, celebrities, influencers, anybody we admire from a distance. A person we look up to can begin carrying much more than simple admiration inside us. They can begin representing values we want to believe in, strength we respect, success we aspire towards, clarity we wish we felt, a certain way of being that we have emotionally attached ourselves to. And then, when dishonesty, inconsistency, manipulation, selfishness, cruelty, or any other negative traits begin showing up, the issue is not always that the signs are weak or that the signs were never there. Sometimes the signs are already there. What becomes difficult is us seeing it. What becomes difficult is letting those signs mean what they truly mean. Because if we truly understand and fully understand and completely understand what is showing in itself, we may have to let go of what that person represented inside of us. We may have to admit that our admiration was attached to an image that no longer holds. We may have to feel the loss of what we projected onto them. We may have to realize what they meant for our own identity, our own hopes, our own sense of direction. So once again, understanding gets softened. We tell ourselves it was taken out of context. Others are all being too harsh, that one flaw should not define the whole person, that perhaps there's more going on behind the scenes that we don't know of. And yes, sometimes context does matter, but other times, what is really happening is that we are protecting our attachment to who we want them to be. And typically in these scenarios, when we see this pattern of conditioned response, when we actively resist understanding, something very familiar is unfolding. The issue is no longer simply whether a pattern is visible. The issue is whether we are willing to let that pattern be what it means. If we are willing to let that pattern alter what we know that gives us a sense of belonging with what we aspire or what we value. Because once we let it mean what it means, we may have to change how we relate to it. We may have to grieve. We may have to pull back. We may have to stop defending. We may have to accept that something we hoped was true is no longer available to us in the same way. And this is why judgment is not the answer here. As with every conditioned adaptive pattern we can take on under pressure, if we meet this with harshness, contempt, shame, all we do is add a threat, another threat to a nervous system that is already trying to protect itself. And that matters whether the pattern is showing up in our own selves or in someone we care about. Judgment does not create the condition for steadiness. It creates more pressure. It makes our mind and nervous system brace harder, defend harder, and hold tightly to what is already familiar. We can be tempted to say, why would anyone not want to understand what is right in front of them? But what is right in front of them is not always the hardest part. The hardest part is what understanding would ask them to do with what is right in front of them. It may ask them to grieve. It may ask them to stop waiting. It may ask them to stop defending someone. It may ask them to revise how they see a friendship, a family member, a leader, a public figure, a relationship, a role, or even their own previous choices. And when we recognize that the question changes, it is no longer why are they not seeing it? The deeper question becomes, what feels too costly about fully allowing this to mean what it means? The question creates so much more room for the truth, and it also creates more room for our own return to internal steadiness. Because the moment we begin asking the question honestly, without performance, without harshness, without trying to force a conclusion before it is integrated, we begin making it safer for our mind to collaborate again. Cognition no longer has to work only as a defense. Emotion no longer has to keep fighting for its signal to be heard. Consciousness no longer has to stay split between noticing it and denying it. The nervous system can begin learning that what is unfamiliar and destabilizing is not the same as what is truly dangerous. And this is what our return back to an integrated, fully collaborative, and aligned mind begins. Not in forcing ourselves to know faster, not in demanding immediate action, but in allowing ourselves enough honesty to admit where understanding is already forming and where we are resisting what it may be asking of us. And that brings us to the close of today's episode. Today, we stayed with one of the quieter ways pressure can shape our inner world. We explored what happens when understanding is already becoming available, and yet something within us is resisting fully accepting what is there. We looked at how this can happen in direct relationships where repeated patterns become visible and still we can soften them. We looked at how this can happen in parasocial relationships where admiration and projection can make negative traits harder to let in. And we walked through what can be happening across our cognition, our emotion, our layered consciousness, and our nervous system when understanding starts feeling more costly than we are ready to face. And as always, before we move forward, I do want to leave us all with a few reflective considerations to sit with. Where in our lives is understanding already further along that we may be willing to admit? Where have we been asking for more proof? And what feels difficult may not be the evidence, but the consequence of what that evidence would mean. And where have we been softening something not because it is unclear, but because the full truth would ask us to let go of a familiar version of a person, a role, or even our own prior understanding. If today's conversation resonated with you, I would love for you to stay in this work with me and share your reflections through the platforms you're listening on. Your experiences and insights continue adding so much depth to the collective growth we're all building together here. And next week, in episode 11, we will move into when what matters gets ignored. Because when understanding keeps getting softened, delayed, or left partial, what often begins slipping next is not only clarity. What begins slipping is our relationship with what actually matters most. Thank you for joining me today. I am Gayatri, your host. And until next time, let us keep strengthening our mind, deepening our awareness, and stay honest with ourselves, where our understanding no longer has to be softened or denied for us to feel safe.